consider Dan the most creative ecologist or scientist I've ever met, and one of the most knowledgeable people about the challenges that we face in conserving forests and shaping the future of forests. So Dan, thank you so much for agreeing, talking to everyone, to us. And then to start with, I'd like you to give some highlights of your career as an ecologist, going to the Amazon. How did you have these ideas to ask simple questions that pretty much shift the paradigm in how to understand forests in the Earth system?
Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks for this invitation and for that really kind introduction. It's, I guess I would start in the frontier town of Paragominas back in the mid-'80s, and Brazil was just about to have its first free elections since the 60s. It was a very exciting time in Brazil, and the Amazon was in the middle of all of these huge colonization experiments. And I decided to study the drought stress physiology of seedlings in pastures. Why do pastures not go back to forests when they're abandoned? And I sort of got sidelined. I ended up doing some of that work, but when month after month it was just so dry, and the forest was green and growing, and so I because at that time back in the 80s there was the idea that tropical forests were very shallow. You really only needed to look down 50 centimeters and you pretty much understood the ecosystem. And by talking to well diggers, they all said, oh no, we've done tree roots down to 14 meters, 16 meters. And so I decided to focus on that. How deep is the forest of the Amazon, and what role do those deep roots play? And it turns out that one of our holes went to 22 meters, and there were roots all the way down to the bottom. They were mycorrhizal, so they're clearly having some role, perhaps, with nutrients. And that led to really the idea that, wow, that half of the Amazon has this really severe dry season, that if it weren't for this amazing tolerance of drought, those forests would probably be savannas. And so And then, well, what are the limits of that drought and the ability of those forests to weather really extreme dry seasons? That sort of shaped my research for the next 20 years, really. And what are those limits? What are those thresholds? And so we discovered that everywhere in the Amazon, we looked, which is only about 5 places. These are really tough, deeply rooted ecosystems that have obviously evolved in the face of periodic mega droughts. And today we're sort of pushing them to the limits again. And some of my work back then, my weekends, I would hang out with sawmill owners and cattle ranchers, and the experiment was done on a cattle ranch. And that family I would spend a lot of time with, and just those relationships sort of pulled me more and more into some of the more practical questions of ecology, of how forests survive in active frontiers, where the rule of law is very weak, and where some of the laws that are in place to protect forests are not really being implemented. But back to ecology. I guess the whole idea of taking entire ecosystems and manipulating them, which I must admit, my advisor in grad school, Herb Borman, he had done this at the Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Experiment for 25 years, just taking entire watersheds and manipulating them, really to understand the ecological basis of logging and the different logging regimes and forest management regimes of New England. But he was very encouraging to me to do these big experiments. Paulo, when you came into our big rainfall exclusion experiment, really to ask that question of how far can you push these forests in terms of drought before they start to fall apart? And that was, we didn't really know, and our hypotheses going into that experiment were very much, well, surely the understory species would be the first to go, shallow rooted, they don't have access to water. Um, but then our surprise in 2003 when so many large canopy trees started to die all at once, that ecosystem had run into really the limits of its ability to avoid seasonal drought, that we had made worse through our rainfall exclusion, and started to fall apart. And the so this sense, I think today we hear a lot about the tipping point, and I remember back in the 90s exchanging emails with or letters even with Carlos Nobody, who was doing his PhD on savannization of the Amazon. And I think before we get to the tipping point, it's clear that these forests are going to start to suffer during these really extreme dry periods. They're going to become vulnerable to fire, even though they're not vulnerable in most years. And so before we actually have a new rainfall regime in the Amazon, we're going to see a lot of forests just degraded through repeated fire, as your paper that you just led, Paulo, shows very well, looking out into the future. Really important piece. So I think that a lot of ecology is looked at focusing on the plant-animal interactions and species to species differences. And above that are these huge transformations which are affecting the ability of the forest to survive. And if we exceed these thresholds of drought tolerance, if we exceed the thresholds beyond which fires are so severe they kill a lot of trees and really open the forest up to invasion, for me, that's a really exciting role for ecology, is to really point the direction to some of the big interventions that are needed to conserve the forest, not within protected areas, but to conserve the regional ecosystem. And anyway, I probably said too much. I'll stop there.
No, it's great. And I was just going to add that I'm just going to add the point that by using all that water deep down into the profile, you also change the way people perceive the role of forest in the hydrological cycle as well, because then plants could use much more water than what we thought before. And I think that it was a big revolution in science. And then I'm going to ask you, Dan, about for you to explain a little bit of the idea to measure forest degradation even before we had the remote sensing capacity to do so. Because I think we tend to look at forests in a binary way. There's forest, there's not. And then you said, well, what's the size of forest degradation in the Amazon? And I think that is another landmark in Amazon conservation. If you can talk a bit about that study in science, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Paulo. Going back to the mid 80s in Paragominas, there were about 150, 200 sawmills in Paragominas, and they were all pulling these huge logs out of forests and punching these big holes in the forest. And this is just before Brazil started to measure deforestation every year through the PRODE system. I believe that launched in 88. This was 84, 85. And what we were seeing then, and Chris Yule, my other mentor, and Bob Buschbacher published a paper showing that after logging, these forests, which usually don't catch fire, the fire is going in. And so, I was surrounded by all of this forest degradation, but the discourse about the Amazon was still about sort of assuming that if there's a forest there, it's pristine. And we didn't at that time have a really good way of measuring it with satellite imagery, and that is degradation, reductions in canopy density. And part of what was going on at that time in the Amazon too was all of these research-based NGOs were cropping up. Chris Yule and Toby McGrath launched Amazon, and others of us got together, Paolo Molchino, Toby McGrath again, Jose Benacci, we lost IPAM, and Amazon was studying sawmills and getting these detailed information on the volumes of production of sawmills, how far they're going. And we put this data together with our own data on fire and published a paper in Nature in 1999 called Large Scale Impoverishment of Amazon Forests. And subsequently, Greg Asner and others were able to quantify degradation with satellite imagery. But I feel like it was a time when, it was important for both the scientific community and the conservation community to really step back and say, wait a minute, there's all sorts of pressure on these forests and alterations that are taking place. It's not just clear it or not. It's if it's standing, is it degraded? Another side of this too is, well, there's all of these secondary forests. How quickly do they recover the hydrologic functions of forests and really reestablish some of the evapotranspiration? So I feel like it was a very exciting time, late 90s and early 2000s, in the midst of the LBA experiment, this huge NASA and Brazil run experiment on the Amazon, where we had more scientific focus on the Amazon than ever before in history. And just from the atmospheric chemistry, climatology, land use systems. And I was struck in designing that experiment, this is probably 96, 97, there was a lot of resistance to looking at logging and fire because there were several folks who were saying, those are not really the key issues in the Amazon. And it's really all about deforestation. And at any rate, it came into the LBA experiment, and today we know, as your recent paper shows, Paolo, big scale fire and standing forests is maybe one of the biggest risks that the Amazon is facing.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And then you've been working, you've moved towards more conservation over the years, work in the Amazon for a long time with the basic ecology, and over time you played a major role in sort of pushing some conservation agendas forward, some visions. And can you give a little bit of a historical background on how the conservation shift from the time you started working in the Amazon to what you see now? What are the big pressing issues and how they evolved over time to save the Amazon?
Yeah, and I'll try to be succinct here, but 80s, there was still a lot of focus on protected areas, and clearly protected areas where you can't do economic activities they're a foundation of conservation everywhere in the world. But particularly in the case of the Amazon, it became clear that if there were not economic uses, if there were not a way of people to sustain themselves in the region and still keep forests standing, that the conservation agenda was going to be restricted to whatever you could put a fence around. And so I feel like 80s and 90s were a very dynamic time. First huge efforts put on sustainable forest management, and we can derive an income by harvesting logs, reduced impact logging, and rotations. And in the end, I feel like it's mostly been a single harvest, and then the forests get converted in some other way, and it didn't really pan out. The whole idea of taming agriculture and remembering that in the late 90s, soybeans were starting to come into the Amazon. And I was really intrigued with the idea about engaging these new actors on the landscape. And maybe it's because of all of those weekends spent with cattle ranchers and sawmill owners in Paragominas, but just fascinated by their stories. They were not evil people. These were people who were pioneers. They were trying to bring economic development into the Amazon, which had a lot of poverty and still does. And I feel like that was the beginning of sort of a paradigm shift in terms of, do you fight agribusiness or do you engage and tame agribusiness? And when Grupo Maggi invited me to set up and do something on their big ranch where you're standing right now, Paulo, and that was probably in 2003, and we had huge discussions in our research group at IPAM about that. And when it was learned that the decision was, yes, we were going to set up an IPAM experiment, Woods Hole Research Center experiment on a Grupo Maggi farm. This is right before Blido Maggi received the Golden Chainsaw of the Year award in 2005 from Greenpeace. We got hate mail. We were ostracized by NGOs. We were, you know, how could you think of working with the devil was the message that we were getting. And IPAM itself was very divided about that. And, but that, you know, doing that experiment on Grupo Maggi's farm got the interest of not just Blido Maggi, who was governor of Mato Grosso, but the entire board of Grupo Maggi. And they asked for a presentation. At that time, there were things like the mad cow disease. So Europe was looking for vegetable protein sources to replace all the animal carcass sources that were going into their animal ration, and worried about provoking Amazon deforestation. And so trying to put brakes on that. The RTRS, Roundtable for Responsible Soy, had been launched in 2005. It wasn't done yet, you know, having a standard that determines what is sustainable soy. 2006, the soy moratorium was launched. All sorts of things were bubbling up where the idea of taming agribusiness was becoming more plausible. And within a few years, lots of other groups were working with agribusiness, and it sort of became a thing. And in the meantime, Blido Maggi, you know, he announced in Bali in 2007 at a climate conference, one of the big climate summits, that he was going to move Mato Grosso to reduce deforestation because he was seeing that his European markets were going to start closing the doors to Grupo Maggi's exports. And in 2009, he announced that Mato Grosso had a 2020 goal of a 89% reduction in deforestation. And in 2012, it achieved an 88% reduction in deforestation. So you have this sort of agribusiness leader, not because he's a nature lover, but advocating for forest conservation, and then taking that into his role in the Ministry of Agriculture subsequently. And today, pressuring current government to not drop the forest conservation agenda because it's going to affect Brazil's ability to sell commodities to these markets. So, you know, that's a long-winded way of describing what feels to me like a shift in conservation. We still need protected areas. We still need sustainable use of forests. But the whole idea that that what used to be sort of a niche market for certified sustainable production, you know, rainforest certified chocolate, you know, that sort of thing, could go mainstream. I feel like we're not quite there. I think the challenge now moving forward is actually to go back to win over those key sectors that we maybe have dropped along the way. You know, I'm particularly concerned in recent years with the way people talk about farmers, and in Brazil and the Amazon, really demonizing them. And I think that instead of recognizing the circumstances that brought them to the region, many of them were smallholders in Paraná or Rio Grande do Sul, and they came up because of government packages, because Brazil wanted to put more economic activity in the Amazon. And because there was a global demand for soybeans that was growing very rapidly, and not to mention the Brazilian taste for beef, driving expansion of the beef industry. And but I feel like that has been very unfortunate, and it helped to sort of polarize environmentalists on one side and producers on the other, and what were really some very important conservationists. A lot of farmers, I think, have cattle ranches because they love to hunt, they love to fish, they love being near the forest, working with livestock. And I feel like we've lost a lot of them because of the way that it's the narrative we build up around saying if you're clearing forest, you're evil, you know, even if you have the legal right to clear forests, or even if the system is designed through the informal economy, through bribes, etc., to favor those who break the law. And those who comply with the law are punished, and they don't get their licenses, they don't get their permits. So anyway, I'm once again too long-winded, and I'll stop there.
No, but it's very curious because when you say that we demonize the farmers, somehow it is also mostly enforcing and trying to tame them in a way that it's not through incentives. And it seems that you've been proposing to win these farmers through incentives. Can you just give a brief taste of what are some of the incentives to win these farmers back, the stakeholders back would look like?
Great, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because fundamentally, the economic logic of deforestation hasn't changed. You know, if I'm a farmer in Brazil in the Amazon region, I'm supposed to keep 80% of my farm at least. That's in addition to the permanent preservation areas in forest. And faced with, well, that hectare of forest that I could clear and put into pasture, it's worth $100 a hectare as forest in the price of my property. If I were to sell, it's probably worth 1,000 if I were to clear it, and or more, a couple thousand if it's good for soybeans. And the price of that same hectare of forest to the global economy is about 50,000 hectares. You know, if you assume 130 or so tons of carbon per hectare, and all of that goes into CO2, you know, the social cost of carbon is about $100 from EPA in the Obama era. And we're coming off a decade with more funding, more corporate commitments, more attention and NGO activity around tropical deforestation as a climate change solution, and that fundamental logic has not changed. If I'm a farmer, I'm no better off now keeping that forest standing than I was. In some ways, I'm worse off, because now I'm accused of being the cause of the destruction, even though my legal rights allow me to expand my pastures. And so I think this is really looking ahead where we're going to see a lot of progress. I think that one of the things that could get done under the Bolsonaro administration is actually putting in place a forest carbon regime. There's hundreds of companies going climate neutral, and almost all of them need to buy offsets. And they could buy offsets from hundreds of little tree planting projects, or they could put it into farmers in the Amazon, like the farm you're on there, and who have forests they could clear and are ready to forego that right if there's a small incentive. And package with that incentive a recognition. And so, you know, we're talking with the Brazilian government now about moving that forward. And the state you're in, Mato Grosso, has a red law, and the governor, Mauro Mendes, is quite interested in moving in that direction, or maybe offering to China and Europe carbon neutral soybeans, taking some of those emissions reductions achieved through reductions in deforestation and using it to basically compensate the embedded emissions in soybeans. That's the Minister of Agriculture. The Minister of Agriculture wants to move that forward. And so I think we're in a very exciting moment. And for me, this COVID pandemic is bringing some really important lessons for Amazon conservation. It's the lesson that polarization and fighting among sectors, including between the environmental sector and the farm sector, is probably not the long-term solution. We need collaboration. We need resilient societies that are able to respond to a crisis in an orchestrated way. We need sources of information that are reliable, and that goes to scientists and what we share as opinion and what we share as, demonstrated fact that's in the public peer literature. And it means regaining trust in government agencies and governments to do the right thing, and themselves to be having a science-based approach. These are all things that I think are very prevalent in people's minds around the world. What are the facts? Is our government following the facts? Who are those science spokespeople from public health arena who we can trust? Here in the United States, Fauci has become this trusted figure who is really inspiring confidence in so many folks today that we're going to figure this out. And so all of that's a long-winded way of saying to deal with the ultimate environmental challenge, climate change, I feel like scientists have to step up. They have to clearly lay out their opinions as opinions. They have to speak in terms that are going to resonate with sectors. They have to avoid the temptation of being brought into sort of partisan sector-specific dialogues, like demonizing farmers, legal farmers, and but also be ready to engage. One of my favorite moments every few weeks is talking to Ricardo Arioli in Momento Agrícola, which goes out to farm radio channels across Brazil. And I love that because I know that what I'm saying is being listened to by farmers. And I want them to know that, if they're doing the right thing on their farms, the markets and the finance mechanisms will be there.
Thank you, then the last point that I would like just to give a taste. You're in California, been living in California for a while now, and trying to build bridges between California and Brazil for conservation, climate mitigation. And many of the students in this class, Future Forests, are from the Los Angeles area, Irvine and nearby. So do you have an example that can resonate or be close to these communities, these students?
Yeah. In 2006, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who would have ever thought, was able to get through the state legislature, the Global Warming Solutions Act, which had an important provision, which is that companies could offset up to 4% of their emissions reductions that the law mandated them to achieve. Any company that's emitting more than, 1 million tons, 10 million tons a year, I forget the limit. And before he left office, he invited governors from around the world, from the tropical forest regions, who would be the beneficiaries of this new market, to come to Los Angeles. And in September 2008 was launched an alliance between California and tropical forest governors, including the governor of Mato Grosso, Blatter Maggi. And it was mostly from Mexico, Brazil, and Indonesia. Now the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, born in California in 2009, includes a third of the world's forests. And they are still waiting for the California market to be implemented. It took a big step forward last year when finally, after 10 years of deliberation, the Air Resources Board of California approved the California Tropical Forest Standard. And that is the last step necessary to regulate the market so that capped entities like PG&E or Chevron or others can start investing in tropical forest conservation to receive offsets. Still not in place. So what has happened in the meantime is a lot of companies have moved forward, as I mentioned, this climate neutral movement. And the big question, I think, is, and Salesforce is one of those. And Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, announced in Davos, as Trump endorsed, believe it or not, the Trillion Tree Initiative. And, you know, part of Salesforce's contribution to climate change is going to be trees. And he wants to eventually get to reducing deforestation, you know, as sort of one of the steps. I had a meeting with Bill Gates. He's not California, but he's right up the coast. 2 hours, me and 2 other scientists talking about climate change. He wanted to know, could tropical forests and 1 trillion trees make a difference? And what he got most excited about, I think, was the possibility that the emerging market offsets could feed incentives and finance into places like Mato Grosso. And so I feel like California has been at the, you know, after Schwarzenegger ended his term, Jerry Brown came in, and we used to bring governors to sit down with Jerry Brown and for them to explain what they were doing on climate change. And he got it, he supported it, and he grew out the GCF. And now with Gavin Newsom, the question is, how do we get him also engaging on this? But I think we're, California is at the head. There's the California effect, which was very prominent for fuel standards in the whole automobile industry. The question is, could the California standard really become a standard used everywhere in the tropics, of which jurisdictions like Mato Grosso should be able to sell offsets, because there's, you know, really strong indigenous peoples engagements and consultations and rigorous accounting and monitoring, et cetera. So be proud that you're in California.
Thank you. And then if you have one quick advice for these students or young scientists who are watching this and want to make a difference and change in altering the future forests and natural environments.
My advice would be, make sure you spend some time knowing how public policy really works. I mean, I came out of grad school thinking that the scientist's role is to put the papers out there, and that information would somehow find its way into policy-making processes. My first job after my PhD was to go to Washington. I was in advocacy, you know, and I remember at the annual meeting of the IMF and World Bank, Chuck Peters' paper on the value of a Caribbean tropical forest, which fit on one piece of paper, both sides, came out of Nature, was being distributed by the thousands. And that same year, there were all of these major policy initiatives underway on trade and forests. And it's sausage making, it's messy. And if you do not understand that process, it's hard to know how to really describe your results in a way that's going to have the biggest positive influence on public policy. I'm not talking about changing the results. I'm just talking about the way we talk about it. You know, I think a recent example is the Amazon forest carbon sink is weakening. That's being interpreted in many sectors that I've talked to as, oh, it's now the Amazon is a source of carbon, maybe we should get rid of it, you know, that sort of thing. Instead of, it's still really important to stop deforestation and degradation. It's still a huge pool of carbon, and this sink, which itself is, we're not sure is there, right? Is maybe weaker. So I think that would be my suggestion. You know, find a way to really spend some time and learn the public policy process, and that I think will make your science stronger and more influential in the public policy arena.
Thank you so much, Dan. I have no words to thank you. So